I never expected that moving in with my new husband David and his son Michael would turn into something far more complicated than blending our lives together. Marrying David was one of the best decisions I'd made, but it came with unexpected changes. Michael had just turned 21 and after finishing school, was trying to figure out his next steps in life. With David off and away for business trips, I was left spending a lot of time alone with my stepson. Things had been comfortable between us, almost too comfortable. We got along great, and it was easy to be around him. Michael was thoughtful, mature beyond his years, and there was never any real tension. At first, I chalked this up to him simply being kind and considerate. But as time went on, there were moments, small ones, that made me question if there was something more, if there was something neither of us was willing to admit. It all came to a head one morning, when I was alone in the house, preparing for a quiet day while David was away on a work trip. I was in the bathroom finishing up my morning routine, the sound of the shower still lingering in the air, and steam curling along the mirrors. I'd been deep in thought, replaying the conversation I'd had with Michael the night before. It had been innocent enough, about his future, his plans. But there was a look in his eyes, a hesitation that I couldn't quite shake. That morning, as I stood at the bathroom sink, drying my hair, I heard a knock on the bathroom door. "Anne?" Michael's voice came through the door, low but gentle. "You in there?" I blinked, surprised. Michael didn't usually knock on the bathroom door, especially this early in the morning. I glanced at my reflection, then turned toward the door. "Yeah, Michael, I'm here. What's up?" There was a brief pause, and I heard him shift on the other side. "Sorry to bother you, but I need to grab something from the bathroom. Do you mind if I come in?" For a moment, I hesitated. The steam still clung to the air, and I was wrapped in a thin towel, my hair damp from the shower. But Michael's voice sounded innocent enough, and it wasn't unusual for him to need something quickly. "Sure," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Come on in." The door opened slowly, and Michael stepped inside. He was dressed in sweats, his hair messy as if he'd just woken up. He glanced at me, then quickly turned toward the cabinet, rummaging through it as he searched for whatever it was he needed. I turned back to the mirror, pretending to focus on drying my hair, but I couldn't help but feel the shift in the air between us. It was subtle, but undeniable. The way he moved through the space, the way his eyes lingered on me for just a moment longer than usual before he looked away. It was enough to make my pulse quicken. After a moment, I heard him stop rummaging. "Got it," he said quietly, holding up a bottle of aspirin. But instead of leaving, he lingered, his gaze flicking back to me. "You, getting ready for something?" "No, just starting my day," I replied, glancing over at him, trying to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Why?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter, the tension in the room growing with each passing second. "I don't know. You look different." The comment caught me off guard. "Different?" I turned to face him fully, towel still wrapped around me, and met his gaze. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, an intensity, a curiosity that made my breath catch. "Different how?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Michael swallowed, glancing away for a moment before looking back at me. "I don't know. It's hard to explain." I stood there, unsure of what to say, the silence between us growing heavier. The air felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension that I didn't know how to navigate. This was Michael, my stepson. I shouldn't feel this way, shouldn't be standing here, caught between wanting to ignore the moment and acknowledging what was happening. Before I could say anything, Michael stepped closer, closing the distance between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him, unsure of what he was going to do. He stopped just a few feet away from me, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm sorry if this is weird," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But I've been feeling something lately, and I don't know if it's just me." My breath hitched. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I had felt it too. That subtle shift in our relationship, the way we seemed to be growing closer in ways that weren't just familial. "Michael," I started, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what this is, but before I could finish, he stepped even closer, his hand gently brushing against my arm. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. It was even exciting me, leaving me breathless. I looked up at him, my heart racing, and in that moment, I knew we had crossed a line, one that neither of us had expected, but one that had been building for some time. "I know this is wrong," Michael whispered, his hand lingering on my arm, "but I can't help how I feel." I couldn't speak. The weight of the moment was overwhelming, and all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't process. This was my stepson, David's son. But the connection between us, the pull I felt toward him, was undeniable. I need to go," I said suddenly, stepping back, breaking the contact between us. My voice was shaky, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. Michael nodded, his expression pained. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I interrupted, trying to steady myself. We'll talk later." Without waiting for a response, I slipped past him and hurried out of the bathroom, my mind a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and something else I wasn't ready to admit. As I closed the door to my bedroom behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? I knew nothing tangible had happened, not yet, but I was in a full blur, uncertain of what to do next. I spent the rest of that day trying to pretend that nothing had happened. I busied myself with household chores, ran errands, anything to keep my mind off the encounter in the bathroom. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the memory of Michael standing so close to me, the way his touch had made me feel, or the look in his eyes that I had never seen before. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I had married David, and Michael was his son, my stepson. Our relationship was supposed to be simple, familial. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted between us, and I hadn't even noticed until it was too late. I was alone in the house for most of the day. David was away on one of his usual business trips, and Michael had gone out shortly after our encounter, leaving me with my thoughts. The quiet of the house felt oppressive, as if it was pressing down on me, forcing me to confront the reality of what had happened. I found myself replaying the moment over and over again in my mind, how close we had been, how his words had made my heart race, and how I had felt that same undeniable pull toward him. By the time evening rolled around, the tension in my chest had only grown worse. I hadn't heard from Michael all day, and a part of me was relieved. I wasn't sure how I would face him after what had happened, and I didn't know what to say if he brought it up. But another part of me, the part I was trying to ignore, missed him. I couldn't help but wonder where he was, what he was thinking, and whether he was feeling the same confusion that I was. I was sitting on the couch, a half-empty glass of wine in my hand, when I heard the front door open. My heart leapt into my throat, and I quickly set the glass down, trying to steady myself. Michael walked into the living room a few moments later, his expression unreadable. He glanced at me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other in silence, the tension between us thick and palpable. "Hey," he said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, tentative, as if he wasn't sure how to approach me. "Hey," I replied, my own voice shaky. I stood up, suddenly feeling self-conscious. I didn't know if you were coming back tonight. Yeah, I just needed some air, he said, his eyes flicking toward the window. He looked nervous, like he wasn't sure what to say. But there was something else in his expression, too. Something that mirrored the way I felt. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This was my chance to say something, to clear the air between us, to put everything back to normal. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at him, at the way his shirt clung to his chest, the way his dark hair fell slightly into his eyes. He wasn't the boy I had met when I first married David. He had grown into a man, and standing here in the quiet of the living room, it was impossible to ignore. Michael took a step toward me, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. About earlier, I'm really sorry, he said, his voice low. I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know what came over me. I shook my head, taking a deep breath. It's okay, I said, though my voice betrayed the fact that I was anything but okay. I wasn't expecting, well, any of that. He nodded, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. I just feel like, I don't know, like there's something between us. And I know it's wrong. Believe me, I know it is. But I can't help it. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, to stop this before it went any further. But the truth was, I couldn't deny what he was saying. There was something between us, something that had been growing for a while now, and I had been too afraid to acknowledge it. Michael, I started, my voice trembling. We can't. This can't happen. You're David's son, and I know, he interrupted, his voice pained. I know all of that, but that doesn't change how I feel. He took another step toward me, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, the space between us shrinking by the second. I wanted to back away, to put distance between us, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I stood there, my heart racing, and instead of him. I reached out and took his hand. The touch was electric, sending a wave of heat through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat, and I saw the same emotions mirrored in his eyes. Confusion, desire, guilt. It was all there, laid bare between us. I don't want to hurt anyone, Michael whispered, his thumb gently brushing over the back of my hand. But I can't pretend like this isn't real. I swallowed hard, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I knew he was right. There was something between us, something that felt real, undeniable. But this was wrong, wasn't it? I was his stepmother, and he was David's son. We couldn't do this. But as I stood there, staring up at him, the warmth of his hand sending my heart into overdrive, I realized that I didn't have the strength to pull away. Not now. Not when we were standing on the edge of something that felt so powerful, so real. I don't know what to do, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Michael stepped closer, his hand tightening around mine. We don't have to figure it all out right now, he said softly, but we can't keep pretending like nothing's happening. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying. And in that moment, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep pretending. The tension between us had been building for too long, and now that it was out in the open, there was no going back. Before I could say anything else, Michael leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine. The kiss was tentative, hesitant, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hand finding its way to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. It was a kiss filled with all the unspoken emotions that had been building between us. Desire, confusion, guilt, and something deeper, something that felt like love. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know where it would lead, but in that moment, I didn't care. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. The reality of what we had just done settled over us, but instead of feeling regret, I felt something else. Relief. Relief that the tension between us had finally broken, that we had stopped pretending. Michael looked down at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotion. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that things between us had changed, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. But as I stood there, holding his hand, I realized that I didn't want to go back, and so I said, "This isn't over." It just came out of my mouth without knowing what I said. That's why I added, "But we'll figure it out." He smiled, and for the first time since that morning in the bathroom, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, we would face it together. And the story was definitely not over yet. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments, shared glances, and unspoken emotions that lingered between Michael and me. After that first kiss, we both knew we had crossed a line, but instead of feeling guilt or regret, there was a sense of relief, like the tension that had been building between us for weeks had finally been released. Yet with that relief came the undeniable realization that our lives would never be the same. David was still away on business, and with him gone, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the house more often than not. The quiet moments we shared together took on new meaning. Every touch, every smile felt loaded with unspoken questions. What did this mean for us? Where were we headed? And most importantly, how long could we keep this secret? One evening, a few days after that first kiss, Michael and I found ourselves sitting on the back porch again. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden glow over the yard, and the air was warm with the remnants of the day's heat. We had fallen into a routine, spending the evenings outside, talking about nothing in particular, enjoying each other's company in the kind of silence that only comes when two people feel deeply connected. Michael was sitting next to me, our knees touching, the warmth of his skin sending familiar shivers through me. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I turned to look at him, he smiled, a soft, tentative smile that made my heart race. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Of course," I replied, shifting slightly to face him. He looked down at his hands, as if gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Have you thought about what this means? I mean, for us." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I had thought about it, constantly, but I hadn't wanted to voice those thoughts out loud, hadn't wanted to confront the reality of what was happening between us. "I have," I admitted, my voice softer than I intended, "but I don't know if I have any answers." He nodded, his eyes still focused on the ground. I don't want you to think that this is some kind of, phase or something. I care about you, Anne, more than I probably should. And I know this is complicated, but I can't stop how I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my heart aching with the truth of what he was saying. I cared about him too, more than I should, but I was terrified of what that meant for us, for our future, for my marriage to David. "I care about you too," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "But it's not just about us. There's David. He's your father, and my husband. If he found out..." Michael's expression tightened, his jaw clenching as he nodded. "I know. I don't want to hurt him either, but I also don't want to pretend like nothing's happening between us." I bit my lip, struggling to find the right words. Everything between us felt so real, so intense, and yet the consequences loomed large in the back of my mind. I didn't want to hurt David. didn't want to betray him, but the connection I felt with Michael was undeniable. "I don't know what the right thing is," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I know that I can't ignore this anymore." Michael looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotion, hope, fear, desire. Slowly, he reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. The simple touch sent a wave of calm through me, grounding me in the moment. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." I nodded, my heart swelling with the certainty in his words. In that moment, everything felt clearer. The fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, all of it faded away, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. We didn't have all the answers, but we didn't need them. What mattered was that we were in this together, and that we cared about each other more than anything. We sat there in silence for a while, the sun sinking lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. The air was still, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets as the day gave way to night. I leaned my head against Michael's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. But as much as I wanted to stay in that moment, reality was never far away. David would be coming home in a few days, and the thought of facing him filled me with a sense of dread. How could I look him in the eye, knowing what had happened between Michael and me? How could I pretend that everything was normal when nothing felt normal anymore? The next few days, Michael and I tried to keep things casual, tried not to dwell on the future, but it was impossible to ignore the reality of our situation. The connection between us was undeniable, but the guilt that came with it was starting to weigh on me. One night, just a day before David was set to return, I found myself lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't escape. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning as it cycled on and off. But I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to Michael, to the way he had touched me, kissed me, made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between my feelings for Michael and my loyalty to David. But the thought of making that choice, of potentially losing one of them, was too painful to bear. As I lay there, lost in my thoughts, I heard a soft knock on the bedroom door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up, my pulse racing. "Anne?" Michael's voice came through the door, quiet but steady. "Come in," I said softly, my voice trembling. The door opened slowly, and Michael stepped inside, his expression serious. He closed the door behind him and walked over to the bed, sitting down on the edge. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his eyes focused on the floor, "about what you said, about David. And I know this is hard. I don't want to put you in a position where you have to choose." I swallowed hard, my heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "Michael, I love you, Anne," he said suddenly, cutting me off. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I love you, and I know it's not fair to ask you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I had known. Deep down, I had known how he felt. But hearing him say it out loud, admitting the depth of his feelings, made everything feel more real. "I love you too," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Michael looked up at me, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. "You do?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I do, but that doesn't make this any easier." There was a moment of silence, and I could see he did not know what to say. And exactly then, I thought I had made my decision. I opened the sheets and my eyes asked him to join me. Now I look back at it. I think I made my decision based on feelings and not rational thinking. But at that moment, I didn't care. He immediately knew what I meant and joined me. I leaned into him and kissed him. It went even further, and it was so amazing. I truly let myself go there. It gave me a sense of relief, as if I had made my choice. But as quick as it had started, as quick as it was over. I can imagine it was exciting for him, and so I understood. After a minute, he reached out, taking my hand in his. And for a moment, we just sat there, holding each other's gaze, the weight of the world pressing down on us. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." And in that moment, I believed him. Although I still knew I had a decision to make, and I also knew the correct answer. The morning that David returned home felt like the calm before the storm. The weight of what had been building between Michael and me was palpable, hanging in the air like a fog that neither of us could escape. We knew that with David back, things would have to change, but we hadn't figured out how. We were no longer just a stepmother and stepson. We had crossed into a new realm of complicated emotions, and as much as I tried to push it to the back of my mind, it was always there, looming. David's return was marked by a warm hug, a kiss on the cheek, and the familiar routine of catching up on the few days we had been apart. He seemed completely unaware of the quiet tension that existed between Michael and me, his usual jovial self filling the house with a sense of normalcy. But underneath that facade, I felt like I was suffocating. Every glance Michael and I exchanged carried the weight of what we hadn't yet resolved, and with David back in the picture, the complexity of our situation felt even heavier. That evening, after dinner, David suggested that we all sit together in the living room and catch up. I agreed, trying to force a smile as I sat down on the couch, my heart racing. Michael sat across from me, his eyes flicking toward mine, but there was no room for conversation between us, not with David there, talking about his trip and all the work he had to catch up on. The small talk buzzed around us, but I could barely focus. Eventually, David excused himself to make a call for work, leaving Michael and me alone in the living room. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands clenched together as if he was trying to keep himself from reaching out to me. I looked down, the guilt gnawing at me. I know, but we can't keep doing this behind David's back. It's not fair to him. He doesn't deserve this. Michael stopped pacing, turning to face me. "What are you saying?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my next words settling heavily in my chest. "I'm saying that we need to figure this out. We can't keep living in this limbo." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mixture of pain and understanding. "You're right," he said softly. "But what does that mean for us?" I didn't have an answer, and the thought of making a decision, choosing between David and Michael, felt impossible. But I knew that continuing to hide wasn't sustainable. If we didn't do something soon, the truth would come out in a way that would hurt everyone involved. "I don't know yet," I replied honestly, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to be honest with ourselves. Whatever this is between us, we have to figure out what it means." Michael nodded, though the sadness in his eyes was hard to miss. He walked over to me, sitting down beside me on the couch. His hand found mine, and for a moment, we sat there in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. His touch was warm, comforting, and I found myself leaning into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "I wish things were different," he whispered. "So do I replied softly. "But we can't pretend forever." We stayed like that for a while, sitting together in the quiet of the living room, the sound of David's voice on the phone drifting in from the next room. It felt like the calm before the inevitable storm, and I knew that sooner or later we would have to face it. The next morning, as David left for work, I found myself standing in the kitchen with Michael, the silence between us filled with all the things we hadn't yet said. I could feel the tension building, the need to talk, to decide what came next, but the words wouldn't come. "I think we need to talk," I said finally, breaking the silence. Michael nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it too." We sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of our conversation pressing down on both of us. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts, but it was difficult. Everything about this felt so overwhelming, so tangled. "I love David," I started, my voice shaking. "But I can't ignore what's been happening between us. I care about you, Michael, a lot, and I don't know how to reconcile that with my marriage to your father." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't want to hurt him, Anne, but I don't want to lose you either." His words hit me hard, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to lose him either, but the reality of our situation was undeniable. We couldn't continue like this without it all falling apart. "I think we need to take some time," I said slowly, my voice trembling. "We need to figure out what this is without rushing into anything, and maybe that means stepping back for a while." Michael's face fell, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "Stepping back?" he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, my heart aching. "I think it's the only way we can figure this out. We need to be sure about what we're feeling, and we can't do that while hiding everything from David." Michael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. I could see the conflict in his expression, the same conflict I felt deep inside. Finally, he sighed, nodding slowly. "Okay," he said softly, "if that's what you think is best." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "I don't want to lose you, Michael, but we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I don't want to lose you either, Anne, but if this is what we need to do, then I'll do it." The conversation left me feeling drained, but also relieved. We weren't pretending anymore. We were acknowledging the truth of what was happening between us, and that was the first step toward figuring out what came next. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. In the days that followed, Michael and I kept our distance, trying to give ourselves the space we needed to think. It was difficult, painful even, but it was necessary. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that whatever happened, we would face it together. Eventually, we would have to make a decision. But for now, we were taking it one day at a time, navigating the complicated emotions that had brought us to this point. And no matter what happened, I knew that the bond between us, the connection we had, would remain, even if it had to change. As I lay in bed that night, the house quiet around me, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was enough, for now.